They can make you feel like the world is imploding around you or put you in a low but steady state of anxiety. In the realm of sexual betrayal trauma, we call these emotional triggers. And like most pain, they can be our teachers if we learn to manage them well. Hi, I'm Kim Pullen, and welcome to the Hope for Spouses Lunchtime Live. If this is your first time joining us, thank you for coming. I want to give you just a little bit of a background. And so I started the Hope for Spouses ministry about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And I started it because my husband and I had been through our own recovery process. We were separated for 4 years due to serial adultery. And when my husband pursued the world, I started getting focused on dealing with my issues, my trauma, and how to deal with what secular terms are codependency, but really in spiritual terms is idolatry. And so I really wrestled with those things, and God eventually, because I focused on myself, let my husband do his own recovery. God worked on my husband's heart, and eventually my husband turned around and repented and changed and got the support and help that he needed so that we can reconcile. We've been back together for a little over 4 years, and we have an incredible marriage now, and we really make it part of our mission now as part of the recovery process is to help other couples that are going through the same thing that we did, and really to give them hope that with God they can overcome. Now today we're going to talk about something that, especially on a day like today, which is 9/11, that creates triggers for a lot of people, especially if you were in New York when this happened. But if you've lost family or anything, there are emotional triggers that happen, and that's because of trauma. But it's not reserved exclusively for catastrophic things like 9/11, but it's also for small core wounds that we got from childhood. So we're going to talk about how these triggers, where they really come from in our emotional makeup. So first of all, let's make sure we're on the same page with our terms here. So what is an emotional trigger? So usually we think of triggers, we think of them from a negative perspective. You know, we're traumatized by emotional trigger. Either our husband does something, or if you're a guy watching this and your spouse is the unfaithful one, your wife does something that causes you to get very anxious, very obsessive, very fearful. And you can respond a bunch of different ways. And we can think of these as negative, but there are positive triggers. And we're going to get into how this works physiologically in our body. But there are positive triggers. I mean, you can think of them, that you have a memory of the smell of oranges or your grandmother's house at Thanksgiving. And so there are a lot of positive triggers that give us a sense of peace and security and confidence. But we do have those negative ones as well. And the negative ones, really, the purpose for those triggers is to protect us from danger. Okay? Now, we're going to find out what exactly I mean by what is happening when we have these triggers. So, you know, I'm going to simplify this way down. I am not a neurologist. You know, I don't know all the little details about the brain. It works. None of us do really, because it's very, very complicated. But I'm going to simplify this down and really so it can apply to what we're talking about here when we talk about recovering from sexual betrayal trauma from when our husband either commits adultery or is addicted to porn. Now, there are 3 parts of the brain in what we call the limbic system. And this is the earliest developmental part of the brain. It's the most basic part of the brain. And it's the one that really controls our survival mode. Now, there are 3 parts to the limbic system. Well, there's more than 3, but the 3 ones that we're talking to pertaining here, okay? So the first one is the amygdala. And you can think of the amygdala as like the assessor. And it assesses the emotional value of a stimulus. So for example, you're walking along the road and you see something squiggly on the road and you jump back. Your amygdala was the first thing that responded. It wasn't your cerebral cortex, which is up here, which reasons through everything. It was your amygdala that triggered, like, what is that? And so you'll jump away from it, and then you'll feel foolish because it was just a stick, okay? But that's what the amygdala does. Is it like, okay, it tries to like figure out, okay, what is the response I need to have from this? So it's really the should, should we respond, that fight or flight response that really has preserved us for centuries and has preserved our own lives here today, maybe keeping you out of danger, getting out of the way of a car or running away from a stranger. Those are all things that our amygdala recognizes, and we do a fight or flight response. Now, the next one is the hippocampus, and the hippocampus evaluates the alarm based on our past experiences. So basically, it goes into our short and long-term memories and goes, is this caused us problems before in the past? And so going back to the snake thing, if we, have this dreaded fear of snakes, or we've been bitten by a snake before, or whatever, so we see a squiggly and our hippocampus is like, oh, this is a snake, and so it reacts immediately. So it goes back into the memories and figures out if it's something that we need to be alarmed about. Now, the third part of the limbic system is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus regulates at what level you should respond, okay? So it increases your heart rate, increases your breathing, makes you run in the other direction, So all of these things, are in a response to that. So all three of these things work together. The amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus are all working together. And of course, when we are triggered, it happens almost instantaneously. That's how fast our brain works. Very, very fast. And we don't really have a chance to think a lot of times about what's happening. And usually when we're triggered, we just feel this rush of something, or it's this low, steady hum of anxiety that's going on inside of us, and we sometimes don't even recognize it. So, and oftentimes when we're triggered, especially if we've been living in a stressful situation for a long period of time, we can be triggered and we don't even know it because we've gotten so used to this high stress level. Our prefrontal cortex gets flooded with what's called, and I'm going to forget its name, cortisol. And it floods our brain so we can't even reason and think well. So, but when we have a lot of these traumas and we live in this constant state, it sort of what happens is our brain kind of malfunctions. And it leads ultimately, if we're staying in this constant state of stress all the time, especially when we have that low level of anxiety where we're living with it all the time, it can eventually lead to autoimmune disease, heart disease, and even to cancer. And what's because is our body reacts to things. We sometimes think that the body is isolated. It's just the physical body and then the mental and then the emotional, that they're all separate, but they're not. They all really work together for our health. Now, there's a really good couple of books I wanted to share with you here. Now, the first one is by the author Bessel van der Kolk. Got a little challenging name there, but especially for us English speakers. But The Body Keeps a Score. I read this and it transformed the way that I really viewed trauma, because we don't just get rid of trauma just because, time passes. Time does not heal all wounds. In fact, it sometimes makes them worse because we're not dealing with the initial core wounds. And then Nadine Burke-Harris, she's actually got a really good TED Talk called, her book is called The Deepest Well, and it's based on what she calls ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And these books are amazing. They really help open my mind up to how trauma impacts us, not just emotionally, but how it affects us physically. And it can affect us for a long period of time, and really even cause physiological damages. So, and that's why it's so important that we really address these core wounds, this trauma that has gone in our life. And I think triggers help us. They kind of push us in that direction. Now, I want you to look at this for a second. So these are the books, but I want you to think of it from this perspective, okay? So our past impacts our present. It will also affect our future if we don't address our past in the present. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So we're having these triggers, and sometimes we don't even know why, and it's because sometimes we suppress things. and or we don't want to deal with it. It's too painful. We don't want to, and if we don't deal with it, eventually it will affect us. So really, we have to address these things. We have to go after them instead of running away from them. Now, again, we talked a little bit about how negative triggers and there's positive and negative. Now, I want to give you a definition, kind of like a working definition for really what a negative trigger would be. So it's an emotional reaction from an unhealed internal wound, okay? An emotional reaction from an unhealed internal wound caused by an external stimulus. All right, one more time. An emotional reaction from an unhealed internal wound caused by an external stimulus. Okay, so it's not exclusive to sexual betrayal. You know, it can be related to any of our senses. The smell of oranges, the sight of clowns, riding in the backseat of a car, being in a darkened room. All of these can trigger responses, and it's emotional responses. So what are some of these physical responses we can have? So emotional triggers can actually stimulate an anxiety attack, or what we would call panic attacks. All right. Now they can be severe or they can be mild. So severe triggers, these severe attacks can be very disruptive to our life. They can cause a rapid heart rate, feelings of detachment, a tightness in your throat, like you feel like you're choking. They can cause hot flashes, or you to profusely start sweating, trembling, nausea, dizziness, disorientation. Okay, all of these are more like the severe responses. I'll give you an example from my own life. So my husband and I have been back together for about maybe 8 months or a year, and we've done pretty well. And we were invited by some friends to come over for lunch after church. And so we were driving to their place, and I knew where his affair partner lived. He had actually lived with her for a period of time, and I usually avoided that part of town because it just triggered too many memories. And as we were driving in that direction, and we kept driving in the direction toward where she lived in her housing development, and I could feel my heart starting to increase. And when we pulled into her development, I almost jumped out of the car. I was just freaking out in the car, and I had my 2 teenage daughters in the back seat. I was starting to hyperventilate. I was trying to not make a big deal of it because my girls were in the back, and we were going to see friends, but I just couldn't control it. And finally, we pulled up in the driveway, and it wasn't near her house, but it was in the same development. And you know, my girls got out of the car and went inside, and my husband was like, "Are you okay?" And I was just like, I started crying. I was just freaking out. And he was like, "I am so sorry." He knew that she was in the same development, but he didn't know that I knew. And he wanted to save me, and this reaction that I had, and so he didn't say anything because he was afraid of the reaction I would have, but he didn't know that I knew. So he was like, "It's okay. I'm here. I'm with you. I've chosen you. You know, we're close to God." You know, it was like he really just tried, and it took some time. I mean, a good 5 minutes for me to just like slow my breathing and calm down. But that's an example of a severe reaction, a severe trigger, and how it literally disrupts everything that you're doing. Okay. Now, a mild trigger can be one that you just continue functioning, you know, that you can go to work, you can be with your kids, but you're distracted, you know, you're fearful, you're discouraged, you feel a little disoriented. You have these uncontrollable thoughts, self-doubt, guilt, shame, embarrassment, even maybe like these low feelings of bitterness. And they affect, I mean, you can still keep functioning, but they affect your productivity. You know, they affect your confidence and your focus. And if we continually get triggered every time, okay, like that, we learn to like live in that mode, but we're just not at peace. We're not happy. I'll give you an example of a mild trigger from my own life. So when my husband and I separated, we had been owning and running a fitness studio. And when we separated, my husband, I walked away from the business, and he took the studio and moved it to a new location. And he took it with his affair partner. And it was only like 5 minutes from our house. So literally every time I drove by the strip mall where it was located, I was triggered. And I had to learn to get to a point where it couldn't throw me off to the degree that it did initially. It's like it's always there, but you can't stop functioning. And so it's kind of like when you stub your toe and you keep hitting it against something. Initially it drives you crazy and you're wanting it to heal, but it's always there. It's always throbbing. It's always bothering you. Like I said, sometimes we don't even recognize that we're having this continuous triggering until we really sit back and examine it. So it doesn't really matter what you call it, though. You can call it an anxiety attack, you can call it a panic attack, or you call it an emotional trigger. But they're all sometimes completely overwhelming, and really they come down to being a fear of overwhelming fear or being out of control. And they really trigger our fight or flight response. Now, I think it's really important that we start getting to a point that we start accepting triggers as part of our recovery process. Now, it's not fair, okay? It stinks that we have to deal with this stuff. But a lot of our triggers aren't really totally geared toward what our spouse has done. Some of them are. But there are others that were triggered because of other core wounds that we've had in our past, and we just don't know it. So we have to really recognize that these triggers are revealing things about our past, about maybe core wounds that we have, and we all have them. I don't care if you came from the most perfect family, okay? We all have core wounds from our past. We live in a sinful world. People sin against each other. It's just a part of the life that we live in this world, and it's going to be that way until we go to heaven. Some of those traumas are more severe than others, but we all have them. And there was a great book by an author, a good friend. Her name is Robin Wiedner. She has a wonderful book that I wanted to share here as well. It's called Grace Calls, and it's really her. She walked through and had her account of her spiritual recovery, and really talks especially about how abandonment, addiction, and abuse from the past, how they really affect your current issues with your spouse who has betrayed you sexually. Okay, so she even talks about, she has an example in there where she talks about how when she was working through her trauma, there came to a point where she started remembering things from her childhood, and she didn't even remember that she had been sexually abused by a family member. And it was because when she was little, she couldn't process it. So her brain literally put it in a closet and shoved it away from it because she couldn't process it. And so it wasn't until she was an adult that she was able to start processing it, and it made sense why there were certain things that triggered her that she didn't even know, like certain smells would trigger her, and she didn't know it until she went back and uncovered that trauma and was able to work through it, and so she wasn't triggered anymore, or not to the degree that she was. She was able to understand why she was triggered. So we have to really recognize that triggers, you can think of them it's kind of humorous, but you can think about it from this perspective, okay? Triggers are our body's way of vomiting up undealt with feelings, okay? That they're on the surface there and we're not really addressing them. So we may be tempted to flee or to medicate them. There's a lot of different ways that we can medicate our feelings. We can just get busy, okay? We can get busy cleaning the house, getting involved in paperwork, paying the bills, and there's a big difference between medicating and taking your mind away from something so that you can rest a bit, okay? But sometimes we purposely avoid the pain from these triggers. And why? Because we just don't want to deal with them. And we've all been that. I mean, I did that for a long period of time. But ultimately, the way that we're going to start healing is we really need to accept them and address them. I mean, the goal is to get to the point when we can accept them and we can look at them subjectively. Okay, it's like we can get over them and really see them for what they are without the emotions attached to them. It's like, like looking at it from above, or looking at it if it's another person. And it's a lot easier for us to be subjective with another person if they're sharing their life and what's going on in their life. It's a lot easier for us to be subjective. But when it's ourselves, it's really hard, And Jesus was really able to subjectively look, I think, at what the traumas that he went through, and we're going to talk about those in a sec, and then he was able to utilize them to move forward and actually to benefit other people around him. So triggers are part of the suffering and empathy process. Jesus went through suffering so he could be empathetic, so he could understand what we were going through. And God allowed Jesus to suffer. And what he said, he's like, to perfect him. So let's look at that. In Hebrews chapter 5, in verse 8 and 9, it says, the son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect. Now that word perfect in the Greek is not like perfect the way we think of it today. It means mature or complete. Then, once he was made mature and complete, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. And then in chapter 2, verse 10 of the same book, it says, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation, Jesus, perfect or mature and complete through what he suffered. The one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So really, God used suffering to help Jesus become more holy. Not more holy, to become holy, to become perfect. He was perfect when he was here, but he perfected him as a human being. He had to be made more perfect. He didn't just achieve maturity. He just didn't arrive complete. He was human just like we are, and he had to work through a lot of things. And he worked through them without sinning, unlike we do, but he was a perfect example. He was the perfecter of that path. And so if God allowed him to go through pain involving emotional triggers, then he's going to allow us to go through it. And this is very countercultural to our society. I mean, our goal in the West is to get rid of as much pain as possible. And I've touched on this before in other lunchtime lives. But, it goes against our culture to be uncomfortable in any way. We try to avoid it at all cost. And we don't really see that it's a teacher that we can learn from, and that ultimately we need to embrace it. And I don't mean in a masochistic way. I mean in a healthy way. So, and I think this is one of the reasons why God brought Jesus into the world as a poor peasant, instead of as a physical king the way everybody expected him to. Jesus was probably, I want you to think about this, Jesus was probably ridiculed as a child. I mean, he grew up in a society where women would be stoned, okay, if they committed adultery or they had sex before marriage. So here is Jesus' mother, Mary, okay, who was pregnant before she was actually really married. And do you think that people they couldn't count the months before that? And, she went away for 6 months, stayed with her aunt or her cousin, and she came back and she was pregnant. She was getting ready to have a baby. So this didn't just, she was in a small town. This stuff doesn't just disappear after it all happens. I mean, this probably stayed with the family forever. And Jesus was probably grew up being called something like a bastard, because as far as anybody else knew, Joseph wasn't his real dad. And he really wasn't. He was his stepdad, so to speak. But so Jesus grew up in this culture where he was marginalized. He was bullied. He was made fun of. And I think God did that on purpose. That because Jesus, the primary people that he really reached out to was the poor, the handicapped, the outcast. I mean, you think the tax collectors, the prostitutes, those who were ill. And back in that time, if you were considered, especially if you were chronically ill, but especially if you got leprosy or you were blind or whatever, it was because something you did and you were bad and you were sinful. So I can't have anything to do with you. I mean, that's the way the society thought. And so this is who Jesus came to set free and heal. These are the first people he came to. These were his people. And so it was, God allowed him to go through that so he could understand, so he could relate. And you think Jesus, we know that his father passed away when before he came into his ministry, and Jesus probably had to take over for him as the head of the family. But think about the widow of Nain, okay, in Luke 7:11 through 17. So here Jesus comes upon this funeral, as a widow with her only son is walking, and Jesus stops it and heals the son by raising him from the dead. And I can imagine that Jesus' heart must have just went out to this woman, because he was thinking about his mom, and that Joseph died, and what was going to happen to her when he went. And of course, there were the sons that could fill in for him, but just the compassion that he felt, that it was a trigger for him. And then even with Lazarus, we can see the trigger actually prompted emotion from Jesus in John 11:35, where they were coming to the funeral of Lazarus, or at least walking out to where Lazarus had been buried, because he had been dead for 3 days. And even though Jesus knew he was going to heal Lazarus, he still cried. He was empathetic with them. It triggered his own feelings, that he was able to have compassion on them. So, and then even in the garden, in Matthew 26:38, why don't we look at that? So Jesus understands sorrow. It says, then Jesus said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So he knew that he was going to his death. He knew that he was going to the cross, and it would be painful. He anticipated. And now, keep in mind, this was, crucifixion was not a new thing in Jesus' time. I mean, the Romans would crucify men. They were experts at it, and they would line the crosses up along the road leading into different cities, just to make people aware, if you rebel against the government, this is what's going to happen to you. So Jesus had seen men on crosses, dying this way. And he knew this was what he was anticipating this in the garden. And so that's part of the reason, I believe, why it said he was overwhelmed with sorrow. The other part, I think, was because he was going to be separated from his Father, and he'd never been separated before. But instead of letting this paralyze him, Jesus uses it as a catalyst, okay, to help save others, us. So he didn't get stuck in the trauma. He actually moved through it. So how do we do that? How do we manage our triggers? Now, the first thing is we can't run from them. We have to resist that instinct, that fight or flight response. Now, we need to be in a safe place to be able to deal with them. In other words, if we're getting triggered and we're staying with our spouse and they're the ones that are triggering us, don't stay there in the middle of the situation, okay? Just step out of the room, go into a different place, go for a walk, and recognize that you're having a trigger. But don't immediately whisk your brain away and try to think of something else and just keep yourself occupied so you don't think about it anymore. That doesn't help you. That doesn't help anybody. All right. So you have to put yourself in a place of safety, but don't run from addressing the emotion of what is going on inside of you. Recognize that you're having a physiological response based on something that maybe you don't even remember, or you do remember, but you don't want to face it because you're afraid, because you don't want to be in pain anymore. Okay. So we have this immediate response. Sometimes it's the hyperlate, the breathing, and we feel like we can't get our breath. And one of the things you can do is just stop and practice some deep breathing exercises. And I'm going to put a link to a video that I created, some of these deep breathing things that you can do, whether you're sitting or standing, that you can do this deep breathing, because oxygen, if you can get oxygen into your body, into your brain, it helps your cerebral cortex start working again, and so you can start reasonably thinking through and logically what's going on, and not simply reacting based on your limbic system. Okay, so again, I'll put that link in the comment section. Now, the next thing we have to do is we have to really go to God in prayer and in Bible study. And Jesus invites us to do this. Let's look in Matthew 11, verse 28. It says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." Learn from Jesus. "For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And see, just like we could see Jesus at the cross, he wants us to learn from him. How did he deal with these? How did he deal with pain? How did he deal with struggle like this? The Psalms are also loaded with examples of people who did that very thing. They were vulnerable to the point of embarrassment. but they went to God to work through their pain, to work through their struggles, to work through the trauma that they were having to deal with. Another thing we can do is journaling. And, you can journal, a piece of paper, with a pen. You can carry a little journal around you with you everywhere. I like journaling on a computer because I type really fast and I can type pretty much as fast as I think. And so I like journaling through, Word, and I'll just type things in. But whatever is, chronicle your journey, because coming from this end of the journey, I wish I'd written more of what I was going through, but I did chronicle a lot of what I was feeling. And it's really good to be able to go back and look at your progress and see, like, wow, this is the way I thought this time. I've gotten past it. I'm doing, it's like encouraging. I'm like, wow, I've gotten really good at this, and this will really help you to trace back the root also of some of your triggers. Like, when this happened, then I reacted this way. When this happened, it was always like around, when he said this, or and maybe with family, as we get triggered by something our mom says. It's like, why does that how come I always react that way when my mom's here? Is there something in my relationship with my mom? And so we can trace things back and kind of get to the root of what is causing those emotional triggers. And then really what it does is this teaches us how to learn to step out of what I call the dance, okay? Instead of staying in and doing the same thing over and over again, reacting to them, feeling the trauma, doing nothing with it, and just pretending it didn't exist, and then you do the same thing over again, and then you do the same thing over and again. It's like we're going to make a choice to step out of that response. We're going to choose how we're going to respond, and we're not going to react. We're not going to let our brain take over and just the fight or flight, okay? We're going to choose how we're going to respond. That's really what Jesus was talking about, the maturity that we become. The struggle helps us to mature. And we learn to be open with safe people who don't try to fix us, people who won't lecture us, people who actually give us spiritual guidance based on the scriptures that are done in context. That we can really go to these safe people, and they can help us to kind of navigate those triggers. Maybe they see things that we don't see, okay? So safe people. And really, ultimately, our goal in doing all of these things is so we can turn triggers from enemies into friends, okay? Friends that eventually become tools that we can use to help others, our friends, and friends that are like strangers, people that we haven't met before that are on a similar journey as us. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of recent victory that I had when I was triggered. So I went to the gym, and that's my son. I don't know if you can hear him. I went to the gym, and I'm trying to work on getting my Zumba class back together. I haven't done it in a couple of years, and I still can remember some of the songs. So I go into the group fitness area where it's empty because there's no classes. And so I was practicing doing some of my Zumba stuff, and the gentleman came in who's one of the instructors there at the gym, and he was working out in the back, and we talked a little bit. It was nice. And so I, kept doing my workout, and he was saying how some of my music was, inspiring and very motivating. And then I put out a song that I've used forever in my Zumba class, and I was always kind of a little iffy about it. It was the B-52's Love Shack. And I don't really listen to the words a lot of times in the music, unless it's like really graphic, and I won't use those. But I just focus on the dance and the moves, because it's just enough for me to keep up with what's my next step. But the gentleman said something that was like, "Oh, are you an emissary of Satan or something?" And I was like, "What?" And I reacted kind of like, I just smiled and said, "I'm just focused on the music." But it bothered me. It was like, oh my gosh, what does this guy think about me and everything? And it's like I only got about halfway through the song, and I shut the song off, and I just went ahead and started doing a cool down, and I used a Christian song, and I sat down on my yoga mat, and I was doing some more cool down. But the whole time I was thinking, I was feeling guilty. I was emotionally, it was like I was emotionally triggered. It was like, whoa, like this whole world just kind of caved in. It was about this big. My world was about this big. And I realized that I felt shameful. And it was like, what? Where is this coming from? And I had to really back up. I'm reading a book called The Soul of Shame, and I'll share that with you another time. But it caused me to start thinking, wait a minute, why am I responding in a shameful way? I'm letting this guy judge me based on one song that I've used in my class. And it's like, I feel like I'm being judged as a person and as a fitness instructor, as a teacher, as all these things. I felt like I was being judged, and I was feeling ashamed. And I was like, why am I responding this way? And I had to stop and really evaluate it and go, wait a minute, time out. I don't know this guy from Adam. And if he wants to judge me based on one song, then that's on him. But I'm not going to let another person create my value for me. And so I was able to like breathe through it and just really kind of, step back and really look at it. And I was like, I don't have to let another person determine how I'm going to think or feel right now. And I was able to like release it. And it was like, yeah, it was like a huge victory for me. But I was triggered by something from my past, and I was able to work through it. And I think that is what we will eventually want to get to, where it's like we're not judging other people, we're not judging ourselves. I mean, I don't want this to ever be even, I'm going to see this guy in the gym, probably more often, and I don't want it to create a rift between him and I. And so, I don't want that for anything. And so I was able to let it go, and it was very freeing. It was wonderful. Now, another thing we can utilize when we are working through trauma is counseling. And I do recommend counseling, but I recommend somebody who is qualified for what you need. Counselors are not created equal. They have all different experience, and you need to make sure that you're seeing a counselor that is experienced in the area that you need. So when you're working through trauma and triggers, then I really recommend somebody who's who's experienced in EMDR, and that has to do with this rapid eye movement therapy that they do, and then something called neuro-linguistic therapy. Now I'm going to go ahead and make sure I include some links on both of these so that you can get some information on them. But I do recommend those. Help me. I did some neuro-linguistic therapy for myself with some very specific traumatic moments when my husband and I were separated, and the therapist really helped me to isolate those things and really look at them objectively, and be able to pull the emotion away from them. It was awesome. Okay, so to sum it up, all right, so we will all be triggered in some way or another, but we want to get to the point where we are not controlled by our responses, that we can learn how to choose what we do with those triggers. And it's all part of the recovery process. Now, if you want to get practical on how you can learn to use the scriptures to transform your triggers into highways of healing for yourself and for others, then I want you to schedule a free breakthrough call with me. I'm going to put that up on the screen. It's hopeforspouses.com/call. Again, hopeforspouses.com/call. And this will enable you to be able to contact me and schedule a time, and we'll get on the phone for about 45 minutes and talk through your situation, and we'll talk about how you can start moving in a healthy direction so that these triggers do not control your life. Okay? All right. That is it. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Hope for Spouses Lunchtime Live. We will see you next week. Take care.